Hello, my name is James Payne, and I am a PhD candidate in the Sloan School of Management in the System Dynamics group. And today I am here to talk to everyone about my model, Paucity and Plenty, and a bifurcated food supply chain. Um, so one of the reasons why we're having this conference right now on the computer as opposed to in person, and one of the reasons why this last well over a year now has been in this sort of virtual environment is because of this critter right here, the novel coronavirus first identified in 2019 and the associated COVID-19 respiratory illness. So at least here in the United States, which is the focus of my modeling work, this was first really discussed in the mainstream press at the beginning of 2020, a little bit in the end of 2019, but primarily at the beginning of 2020, as this example from the Wall Street Journal in early January illustrates. By the end of that same month, the first series of infections in the United States were identified. Fast forward a little bit, and suddenly the impact of this disease, which at this point had taken strong hold in the United States, was starting to be felt in new ways, specifically on our food supply chains. So these are some articles talking about dumped milk and smashed eggs, and other conversations about there being plenty of food in the country, while at the same time, there's a discussion about how COVID-19 and the associated stresses are causing increases in food insecurity and hunger across the US. And this article, I think, succinctly summarizes it, this idea of a massive spike in hunger happening at the same time as food surpluses. So this raised the question, for me at least, of how can such states exist simultaneously in a food supply chain, especially a well-balanced one? Now, some would argue that it's not well balanced. This was from December of 2020, nearly a year after the virus was first identified. This question, has COVID-19 broken our food supply chain? And so one of my questions was, has it? Is this a feature, are these outcomes features of the supply chain itself, the features of the individuals? And I wanted to give myself an opportunity to investigate that. So I start with a model of a bifurcated supply chain. And what do I mean by bifurcated supply chain? Specifically, I'm referring to some sort of producer, in this case a farmer, since we're talking about a food supply chain, and then ultimately two consumers at the far end, some concept of consumer packaged goods consumers and some concept of bulk consumers. And by bulk consumers, I'm primarily focusing on things like restaurants, schools, governments, those who purchase material that has gone through processing, but perhaps not to the same degree of additional processing that would show up in a CPG environment. And of course, there are entities that exist in between these two ends. You have some sort of value-added wholesaler, and then within this model, you have some sort of processor packager. So in this case, also the exact division between the wholesaler and the processor can be a little bit vague in different environments, but for the sake of this model, these are the entities that we explore. So zooming in a little bit more on food production, this is an example of the physical flows of goods. I'm using the visual language that you find in compartmental modeling, specifically referring to those boxes are stocks. Those refer to areas in which material accumulates, and those accumulations are affected by flows. Those refer to those pipes with those little valves on them, which is some sort of change. So in the language of differential equation modeling, this would be expressed this way. The change in that first stock, food under cultivation, is the sum of the inflows and outflows from that process. In this case, model the farm, the producer, as having some idea of work in progress, food under cultivation, and some concept of finished goods, which have already undergone some sort of cultivation or value-added process by the farm. Now, what's interesting and sort of the addition in this space is this idea of endogenous inventory dispositions. So the farmer really has a choice. This idea of increasing food waste and destruction implies that the farm is making a conscious choice about whether or not to sell their products that they're producing, or destroy it, or leave it even in the field longer than is necessarily valuable. And what this implies is some sort of value relationship between the amount of time that something is in that work in progress state and the value you can extract from it versus whatever the existing prevailing market price is. Multiple ways to do this. For the sake of this model, I implement a relatively straightforward trapezoidal value function. And that in turn then allows us to keep track of this concept of maturation time. How long is something under a work in progress state? And then we can go ahead and then use that to then feed back into the concept of value within this process. So how are people making these choices? In this case, it's an economically motivated model where individuals involved are taking a look at the expected profitability associated with each of these three different dispositions: harvest, continue to cultivate, keep in the ground, or possibly dig up and destroy. And then from there, there's a logistic choice function applied to that, weighted relative to this inverse of the reference price. So the generic structure for this choice is modeled here with those arrows representing causal links within this space. While this might look complex, it's reasonably straightforward given the previous formulation. You have this idea here of your physical flow of work in progress. You have this idea of average age of that material. And then you have that average age affects the value of that work in progress inventory. And then in turn, that value affects the probability that the farm or producer will put this material through any one of those three disposition routes we discussed earlier. So for this bifurcated supply chain, this idea of physical movement through this process represented by a series of coupled differential equations can be applied to each sector individually, with the farm flowing into the wholesaler flowing into the repacker, and then the repacker in turn facing the end consumer. Now, linking those simply via physical flows does yield some interesting insights, but is at the end of the day insufficient. People do not necessarily respond perfectly to orders. They respond when it is economically advantageous to do so. Thus, the actual motivation for goods moving through the system is linked to this concept of both inventory and expected profitability, which in turn influence price. So since this is a commodity-based food model, inventory drives down price when there's excess inventory, and of course the converse is true. And then similarly, demand is affected by concepts of future-looking anticipated gross margin as a substitution for profitability. So given those two methods, the physical flow of goods and the interlinking of these economic features, we now have a fully specified both physical and economic model of this bifurcated supply chain with endogenous disposition amongst these three possible inventory choices for the producer. So this model parameterized using sort of this concept of a generic foodstuff, and also balanced the demand between the CPG and bulk consumer channels in order to sort of give both a fair influence on the outcome, and then subjected it to an exogenous shock of 50% loss in the bulk demand signal for the course of 20 weeks. Now, while this might seem like a lot, suddenly one half of your supply chain disappearing, the reality was actually quite a bit worse. For a little bit over 20 weeks, somewhere around 24-ish weeks, 22 to 24-ish weeks, demand in the at least for restaurants, more or less completely evaporated in the United States. And even now, it's slowly only now working its way back up to where it was in 2019. Given that, what does this model produce? Specifically, you have a short-run buildup of finished good inventory throughout the supply chain. Production does quickly drop off. This idea of sort of food starts begins to reduce as the farm attempts to adjust its supply from this drop in demand. But there is this build in the short term as demand dries up and food continues to move through this system. What is interesting there is that the consumer packaged foods, the half of our supply chain that wasn't affected by this exogenous shock, continues to be produced and consumed, but not at a rate that offsets this loss from demand. And what I think is most interesting, if you notice that there's actually a short burst in consumption and demand on the CPG side, which we'll talk about a little bit later, is a direct result of this mechanism, specifically pricing. So this dry up in bulk demand causes pricing to drop in the bulk channel, which in turn actually ricochets back into the wholesale channel, causing a small dip in pricing on the CPG channel, which in turn drives up consumption. What this ends up doing in the short run is driving up consumption, but eventually as this system settles, as those inventory imbalances work their way through the system and it settles on sort of a lower inventory state throughout, and yet higher consumer consumption based around these short-term lower prices, this locks in actually higher prices in the long run in the CPG channel relative to what was there to begin with. What this means is, though, even though the CPG channel was not subject to any sort of exogenous shock, you end up with a group of people who essentially are paying paying more for less consumption. Part of the reason for this as well is actually this idea of, because of the nature of this model, we can keep track of the maturation of the actual food itself. So over this period of time, as the farm is making choices about whether or not to sell their goods based upon the maturation, you're getting this swing in values. And the net result from all of these working together is higher prices for less consumption of inferior quality goods across the supply line. So what we talked about before at the very beginning, and one of the motivators of this project, was this idea of not only the consumer having reduced sort of purchasing power, but also this explosion in food loss early on. And indeed, that does happen in this model, primarily in the form of dumping from the destruction of crops as demand dries up. But what's interesting is this model shows that there could be a secondary surge in destruction later on that's driven primarily from spoilage in the wholesale sector, but throughout the whole process. Essentially, this depression of prices in the short term causes a buildup of intermediate inventories, which are not consumed in a timely fashion and ultimately are spoiled and lost further down. Something to emphasize is these dynamics so far are only from the shock on the bulk consumer side. We'll discuss this a little bit later on, but the influences and the effect on the CPG channel are predominantly generated by the economic linkages and the influence on the bulk side. So some policy interventions. There's two sources of food insecurity and destruction in this model that become very clear. One is this idea of upstream physical flow factors affecting the inventory management, these builds and then sudden dumping of inventory, and then downstream economic factors affecting consumer prices and affecting consumption on that side. So the question is, how can we think of policies that could affect both sides of this separately? So one is this idea of a regulator intervention. So some sort of entity that helps manage this build of inventory and perhaps smooth out the shock. There's actually a precedent for this. In the 70s and 80s, this program, the Temporary Emergency Food Assistance Program, bought dairy products specifically to try to raise the price of milk by about 6 cents and alleviate some pressure on U.S. Dairy farmers, and in turn distributed those non-perishable dairy goods over the next decade. This effectively did what this policy attempts to implement, which is alleviate demand pressure on upstream producers, and then later distribute those goods to downstream consumers. Another possible intervention is this idea of channel silos. The bifurcation of the supply chain quickly becomes a source of these dynamics, both in terms of the physical goods and this idea that these two consumer types are purchasing independent from each other. So the question then becomes, what can we do to break this down? What do we do to allow these consumers to purchase from each other? So in doing so, created this idea of sort of a hierarchical substitution effect, where each consumer would prefer to purchase from their own channel, but have the ability to purchase from the other channel after all demand has been fulfilled from their own channel. This idea of cross-channel purchases, that an end consumer on the CPG side can purchase from the bulk and the bulk can purchase from the CPG, is this idea of breaking down the silos in this bifurcated supply chain. And what are the end results of this? Both policies stabilize long-run consumer prices and break that sort of unexpected outcome of higher locked-in consumer prices. The reduced channel barriers resulted in less waste and less loss, but they did cause a temporary increase in CPG costs as essentially bulk and CPG consumers compete with each other for inventory in the space. The third-party intervention as a large negative requires, well, a third party, a regulator to act in sort of a consistent and motivated way, especially in a way that lasts over the course of the 200 weeks of the simulation space. So ultimately, has COVID-19 broken our food supply chain? I would say not necessarily, but it has highlighted some important structural features that we need to keep in mind. Largest source of dynamics is the bifurcation of the supply chain, and market solutions like increased substitutability are more robust than third-party interventions, but you have to keep in mind that short-term effect on both sides. And then, of course, a second wave of food destruction locked into higher prices is possible and is a feature of this model, and something I think that is important for real-world policy and applications. Ultimately, what this is a flexible model with endogenous behavioral feedback based on economics and physically coupled material flows. With that, I'll say thank you for your time, and I look forward to the rest of this conference.